students, my name is Nicola and I'm from the Pretoria campus, and I will be doing MAUS by Arch Spiegelman with you guys. I'm going to be breaking up this section into two sections. I'm first going to be focusing on postmodernism, and then I'm going to be doing historical context in the second half. So there will be two different videos just because the slides are quite long. And I think that you need a little bit of time and a little bit of focus on each section to make sure that you're getting everything in the most coherent manner. So this is Learning Unit 1, and the Learning Unit is defined as examine the narrative influence of the socio-historical context in which the complete MAUS was written. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first start by talking about postmodernism and give you an introduction, and then for the second half I will be talking specifically about World War II and the Holocaust. So, what is postmodernism? So we're first going to define postmodernism, and the first thing that I say before we even really get into it, before I start talking about it, is you guys did modernism in first semester, so I want you to keep those ideas in your brain at the back of your head about what you have done already, because everything that we're going to talk about, a lot of it is in reference to modernism. If not directly, it definitely has an impact on it, and there is a correlation between the two. So what I would like you to do is just think about how modernism and postmodernism sort of interact with one another, and think about how much of postmodernism is actively different, and what does the post in postmodernism refer to. So these ideas I think you should sort of have percolating in your mind throughout the session. So this is a quotation, and this is in reference to what I'm trying to do is give you an idea of how people perceive postmodernism as people who create postmodernism or postmodernist works of art. So this is a director, and what he has said is, nothing is original. Steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration or fuels your inspiration. Devour old forms, new forms, music, books, paintings, photographs, poems, dreams, random conversations, architecture, bridges, street signs, trees, clouds, bodies of water, light and shadows. Select only things to steal from that speak directly to your soul. If you do this, your work and theft will be authentic. Authenticity is invaluable. Originality is non-existent. And don't bother concealing your thievery. Celebrate it if you feel like it. In any case, always remember what Jean-Luc Godard said. It's not where you take things from, it's where you take them to. So what he's saying here, and this is directly to creators, he's saying that everything, and this is an argument that a lot of authors make, is that the story has already been told. All we're doing is different versions of the same story. And we're retelling it. And there is a difference between originality and authenticity. Authentic means something that feels real and genuine, whereas originality means something that is new. And we often conflate those two terms. And what Jarmusch is saying here is that they're not. They are not necessarily the same thing. They can be completely different because there is a very little originality left in anywhere. We've made films in the most, there's only so many ways we can make film. There's only so many stories we can tell, but we can tell them in new ways. So personally, to me, that encapsulates much of what postmodernism is. So postmodernism is very difficult to define and is often defined in relation to modernism and what has come before it. So I want you to keep that in mind, and I want you to keep in mind all the things that you know about modernism and how postmodernism is going to be a reflection and a conversation with modernism before now. So what I've done here is I've given you a very traditional, lovely little dictionary definition, and I just want to sort of make a comment about something. On the slides, you're going to see I've got a lot of images, and a lot of them are covers of books. Sometimes they're films, sometimes they're not in this section, but later music covers. And I want you to realize that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to sort of inundate you in what the world of postmodernism now looks like and is. So postmodernism is that currently arguably is still going on. It's something we're still in, though some people think we're in postmodernism. But more importantly, you might have read or come across postmodernist works without really noticing it. So when you're taking a look at this sort of these books, these are all examples of postmodernist texts. So every time I have something on the side, sometimes I'll point to it and I'll make a comment, but if I don't, just keep in mind that that's what I'm trying to do. So this is the dictionary definition of what postmodernism is. Postmodernism is a late 20th century style and concept in the arts, architecture, and criticism, which represents a departure from modernism. So as I'm starting there, the first thing that you notice is that it is a departure from modernism. It's taking a step away from it. And a lot of the time, something to keep in mind is that postmodernism reflects back on modernism and sort of critiques it. It's going, well, this is what modernism did, and I don't want to do the same thing as a movement. It is characterized by the self-conscious use of earlier styles and conventions, a mixing of different artistic styles and media, and a general distrust of theories. So I'm going to break this down further for you guys. But what I want you to see and recognize is that most of modernism and postmodernism is in reference to the existence of modernism. And without it, it's very hard to define. And the second thing that I want you to take note of is just how distrustful in general and how mixed media this type of text is. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that. So let's take a look at some of the things that postmodernism wants to do and postmodern wants to talk about. I'm going to go through these in more depth, but these are the sort of 6 things that I have identified that I think are quite essential for you to recognize before MAUS, but also for some of the other texts you're going to do in this semester. So the first thing to note is that, and I'm going to start with the purple up here, some things can be true and false all at once. And this should be one of those moments where you go, what? Why? How? And as a student, you should go, I don't quite grasp that idea. And I'm going to show you a couple of examples, and I'm afraid I'm going to have a couple of spoilers, so I hope you've done all your reading before you're watching these. But there is something to note about the fact that something can be true from one perspective and false from another. And a lot of that is, I mean, this is a very philosophical argument, but more importantly than that, this links up to the green section down here, which is that reality is subjective. Everything is subjective. Subjectivity being how one person experiences something might be completely different from how another person is. So our version of a set of stories could be true, while to somebody else they could be completely false. And also, this highlights in the world of modernism how one set of truths might be very different to another set of truths, and how your version of storytelling might be very different from someone else's version of storytelling. So here, the rules of art no longer apply. And this is something I think that comes up a lot in literature and in actual physical art most clearly, particularly if you're looking at art in sense of in literature, the rules of telling a story no longer apply. We don't have to have the traditional arc of a story. We don't have to have a traditional narrator anymore. We don't have to pretend that this is real. We can be very aware of how false the story is. We can be spoken to as the readers by the actual characters, and not in the Jane Eyre, dear reader, I married him sense, but more in the, well, you know what's going on, but I might not know what's going on. So that's something to keep in mind. And not even the layout of a book has to be static anymore. And I'm going to show you an example of a book that does exactly that you don't have to have text on every page to tell a story. The next here is that it's critical and self-aware, and at times pessimistic. So critical and self-aware, these texts know what they are. They are not pretending to be anything other than what they are. These pieces of work know that they are fiction. They know that they are a piece of text. And what's interesting to note is that the first text we're doing, although we're doing, literature and a lot of the stuff we classify by form rather than by genre, something to note is that MAUS is considered nonfiction and yet is still postmodernist. So that's something that we'll talk about. I've already mentioned this, but reality is subjective. Everything is subjective. So this is, everything is up to your own experience. And in MAUS particularly, because we're having layers of stories being told. The next thing is there is no such thing as originality, which I've talked about, but that does not mean that something cannot be authentic. And the last one is that language is not static. Language changes and moves constantly, and it is not bound by a set of laws put in place by anything like the Oxford Dictionary or by a curriculum or by a teacher or by a lecturer, but language shifts and changes constantly. So now what I want to do is I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail. So the first thing that I'm going to start with here is that some things can be true and false all at once. And I'm sorry to spoil this. I hope I'm not really spoiling it, but I might be. And this is about Fight Club. Now, Fight Club, one of the biggest things is that there is a huge reveal at the end about the characters. And up until that point in the narrative, you think that the one character is telling you the truth. But what's most interesting about this is that that character thinks that they're telling you the truth as well, which means they are actively, technically telling you a lie, but they might not realize it. So this is an example of where the truth is not something that we can hold on to stuck in one place, but rather it is something that shifts and changes as we engage with it and how we look at it and from perspectives and how events roll from one into the other. The next thing I want to do is talk about how rules no longer apply. And this is an example, this is one of my favorite examples. This is from a book called House of Leaves by, and I've got the book here, sorry, it's by Mark Danielewski, I think that's how you say his surname. I might be saying it wrong. And what he did is he wrote a story within a story within a story within a story. And it's actually a horror by genre, but this is not intended to be read. You're not supposed to try and pick out each individual word. What you need to do is from these moments, you should be able to take a sense of discord and possibly almost violence and just uncertainty and malcontent and fear. And so what is happening here is that the form of the text is representing the themes that the text is dealing with. Now, this wouldn't have happened in a modernist text. Modernism was very much about having everything following a set of rules that engages and tells a story or engages with content in a aesthetically pleasing manner. And that every single sentence, every single word, even the position of a single article could have a heavy level of meaning. And postmodernism is going, no, absolutely not. You can have gibberish on a page and it still has meaning and it's still important. So that's an example. You will see in every sort of text that you talk about in the section that the different types of text will engage with how the rules no longer apply anymore. The next is that they are critical and self-aware and pessimistic. So I've chosen to put American Psycho there. For those of you familiar with it, you'll know what I'm talking about when I say pessimistic. And for those of you who don't, I'm not going to tell you because it's vaguely disturbing, but go look up the text. But what this is all about is that these texts know that they are texts. They are not pretending to be real. They are not trying to be Jane Austen and mimic reality and present themselves as truth. What they are is that they know that they are fictional manifestations of an idea, and they are aware of that, and they are critical of that sometimes, and they will engage with the reader on that level. And American Psycho does do this, but so does every single text you will go through, where they are very self-aware. Some of this stuff is quite difficult to talk about without examples, and I'm aware of that. So hold on to these ideas and keep these slides with you, because as soon as we get to the examples in the next set of slides, you'll be like, now I know what she was talking about. So a lot of what I'm talking about here is ideas that we will see be putting into play. So next year, realism is overrated. So sometimes the reality of one person is different to another person. Put John Fowles as the French lieutenant's woman here, because there again is a big reveal at the end, which makes you go, oh, I did not realize that. And that's all about subjectivity. And some people believe specific stories because it's convenient, or because it works for them, or because it's something that fits within their identity. So when we're talking about subjectivity and realities, they're constantly shifting, and depending on which character you're looking at a situation through, that shifts. And you will see that in Fight Club. The next one is there is no such thing as reality, as originality, sorry. And I've actually done a little, this is my own little project here at the bottom. These are all retellings of Sherlock Holmes. Some of them are gender bent, so you'll have female Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watsons. In fact, all 4 of those are, now that I'm looking at it. This is a teenage version. This is a fantasy version. This is told from the perspective of Moriarty. This is a young girl version of Sherlock Holmes, but her name is Nora, I think, and she's like the niece or cousin. Now, the point here is that, as I said, there is no originality. If these would not exist had Holmes by Conan Doyle not existed, but they are retellings. They are retelling stories from a different and more interesting perspective. And that makes them authentic, if not original. And that's something we need to keep in mind, is that something needs to be authentic, but it doesn't need to be the first time the story is told. And then lastly here, I couldn't find a specific example that I really wanted to make work here, but I did want to talk about how language is no longer static, particularly in your later texts. You're going to see a lot of that. But here I've got 2 characters speaking, one using some Australian slang and another character going, I only speak English. And what I'm referring to here is how language shifts from user to user. It is not stuck in the time period, but it's also not stuck and bound by rules. So here's a couple of ideas, and these are characteristics. So what I've talked about was before now was the philosophical ideas that sort of are the background to postmodernism. What I'm talking about here are things that happen in postmodernism very often. These are characteristics. So the first is intertextuality. Now, we talked a lot about that in your first semester when we looked at The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. So this should not be new. But intertextuality is all about how texts talk to one another, and there is no limiting of the ideas and how they can transcend from one to another constantly, and how they talk to each other and how they are often present amongst one another. So for example, here, this is a YA book called Illuminate. It's quite recent, and in it there are references to other authors. It's very aware of what it's doing. It's playing those sort of it's going, I know you've read this book because you're reading this book, so you've probably read this person's work, and it's meant to be like an in-joke. And intertextuality does that. It makes us have a second layer of meaning because we know what the book they're talking about is referring to, or the film, or the music. The next thing is unreliable narrators. You're going to see a lot of this. And in Fight Club, that's most prevalent. But an unreliable narrator doesn't necessarily need to just be somebody we don't trust. It could also be someone who can't tell us the story correctly. So there's a difference between somebody who's intentionally lying to us or someone who is unintentionally telling us the story incorrectly. And we'll see that a little bit in MAUS. The next one is meta-narratives. So this is very experimental. This is when stories are often told within another story, or storytelling changes, or facts are shifted for the purposes of the narrative. And I've put Inglourious Basterds up here as an example of this, because Hitler dies in the film, and we know Hitler does not die when supposedly in the film it does. And your director, Quentin Tarantino, was like, nah, I feel like he needs to die. So this falls into postmodernism because it's playing with narrative, because it doesn't need to follow the rules of history. It doesn't need to follow the rules of events as we've recorded them. Memento is a film that does very similarly, and Memento is done by the same directors, the Nolan brothers, who did Inception and Batman. So if you are interested in seeing how stories are told within stories and very differently, that's a good example. Here I've got a mixture of high and low art, and we're going to do a whole section on high and lowbrow art later. But something to think about is that postmodernism fights against the modernist idea of what is good art. It battles against this, and it goes, no. We do not have rules about that. You can have great art that might seem childish or immature, or I mean, a great example of this is the Austin Powers movies. They are a rip-off of James Bond, but all they're doing is taking the idea that James Bond, the writer Ian Fleming, put into action, and completely throwing them and putting them on in sort of hyperbolic terms. doesn't mean that it is bad art. It's just a parody, and a parody can be as good art as anything else. And then lastly here is genre bending. This means that a genre or text does not necessarily need to follow a specific genre. It can follow multiple genres, and it's not bound to just being one type of text. And this is, I've got a couple of videos here that are really useful. So I've got two postmodernisms here, which Tom Nicholas is one of my favorite YouTubers. He does a really good synopsis of postmodernism, so it's a great idea to watch. And here are some definitions that are very in-depth and complex that you can go and engage with that will give you an idea of how postmodernism is defined in far more complex terms than just the simple three-word definition that we're expecting and are used to. I'm going to stop there for now because otherwise this is going to get very long. So I will stop here for now and I will see you guys in the next video. Okay, thanks.